Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Speak Smart podcast. We're diving deep today into something I think we all struggle with, managing our mental energy, especially with how demanding the world is these days.
Yeah, it's true. It can feel like you're constantly bombarded with information and you always have to be on.
Totally. So figuring out how to manage your mental energy is crucial for, well, everything, really.
Absolutely, both for your success and well-being.
Definitely. And we have a great source to help us understand all of this today, an interview with David Coe, the CEO of Calm.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, he was on Jay Shetty's On Purpose podcast.
Okay.
And I think what's so interesting about David is that he's a tech leader.
So he's in that world.
Yeah, so he really understands the pressures of a demanding job like that, but he's also really involved in the world of mental wellness.
That's a really cool combination. He kind of bridges those two worlds.
He does, which can sometimes seem at odds with one another, right?
Right.
So by the end of this deep dive, the goal is to give you some strategies for figuring out where your mental energy levels are at, what recharges you, and how to use all of that to feel better and be more productive.
Sounds great. I'm ready.
Perfect. Now, David starts the interview with this anecdote about a friend of his who has a really great way of checking in with her kids.
Oh, how's that?
So instead of asking, "How are you?"
Which, people just say fine or whatever.
Right, exactly. She asks him, "How's your battery?"
I love that.
It's so smart, right?
It is. It's such a simple change in phrasing, but it gets them thinking about their emotional state in a really concrete, tangible way.
Yeah. And I think that's such a great question for all of us to ask ourselves more often.
For sure. How often do you stop and think, how is my battery doing?
Right. It's so easy to power through the day without checking in.
Totally. And then we wonder why we suddenly hit a wall or do something we regret.
Definitely. And David takes this battery analogy even further. He breaks down mental energy into 4 zones, kind of like a 0 to 100 scale.
Oh, interesting. Okay, tell me more about these zones.
All right, so first you have 0 to 25%, which he calls the critical recharge zone.
Okay.
This is when you're feeling completely drained, can't focus, just blah.
Oh, yeah, I know that feeling.
We've all been there. And this is when you know you really need to prioritize rest and recovery.
Gotcha.
Then you have 25 to 50%.
Okay.
And this is where you're starting to feel drained. Your focus is wavering. Maybe you're getting a bit more irritable. Tasks are feeling harder.
It's like your warning signal.
It is, yeah. Like time to take a break.
Step away and recharge.
Exactly. What about 50 to 75? What do you think that looks like?
Well, I guess that's where you're functioning all right, but you could use some proactive recharging. Maybe you're feeling a bit on autopilot.
Yeah, just going through the motions.
Not at your peak.
Right. Okay, last one, 75 to 100.
That's got to be when you're feeling great, right?
It is. It's when you're energized, focused, motivated. Things are easy.
You're firing on all cylinders.
Exactly. So I think what's so helpful about this framework is it gives us a language to describe how we're feeling,
Totally, yeah. No more guessing games about your mental state.
And it helps you figure out what's draining you and when you need to prioritize recharging.
It's not just about avoiding burnout. It's about figuring out how to be your best self.
Exactly. It's not just surviving, it's thriving.
I like that. And that kind of leads into another point David made. We need to shift from powering through to powering up.
Okay, tell me more about that because that sounds really interesting.
So it's about challenging this idea that we always have to push ourselves, even when we're feeling depleted. David talked about how he was taught to just power through it, even when he was struggling with stress as a teenager, which led to some unhealthy coping mechanisms.
It's so common, right? Don't show weakness, just push through it.
It is, and it can be so harmful. David argues we need a better understanding of mental health. Embracing vulnerability and asking for help when we need it.
Being able to recognize those signs and actually do something about them.
Yeah. He also talks about creating a recharge culture.
What does that look like?
So he describes what they do at Calm. They have company-wide meditations, gratitude practices, even Zoom-free days.
Wow.
It's all about creating an environment where people can take breaks, disconnect, and prioritize their mental health.
That's so great. It's inspiring, even if you aren't a leader at a company.
Totally. We can all advocate for that kind of culture in our own workplaces, no matter what our role is.
For sure. And I think that starts with leadership setting the tone.
I agree. And part of that is being vulnerable, right?
Absolutely. David talks about how leaders need to be open about their own struggles. He gives examples of his own vulnerability, like talking about his relationship with food and his weight fluctuations.
And by being open about those things, he's creating a safe space for others to do the same.
Yeah. It really challenges that idea that vulnerability makes you seem less capable as a leader.
Definitely. He said there's often a fear that showing vulnerability will make you look weak, but he thinks the opposite is true.
Makes sense. Vulnerability builds trust.
Exactly.
It makes me think about how we can all be more vulnerable, at work and in our personal lives.
It's a good thing to think about.
But I guess the next question is, how do we know what actually recharges us? Is there like a magic formula?
That's a great question.
Because we've talked about all these different zones of mental energy, but how do we actually get back to the 75 to 100 zone?
Right.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, David compares it to having different chargers for different devices. You have to figure out the activities that recharge you.
I see. Like what works for one person might not work for another.
Exactly. So it could be sleep, meditation, exercise, spending time in nature, listening to music, connecting with loved ones. You have to experiment and figure out what works for you.
Okay, so there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Nope. It's all about self-discovery.
That's really fascinating. I feel like we've only just scratched the surface here.
Yeah, there's so much more to unpack.
But this is a great starting point.
Definitely. We have a much better understanding now of how to figure out our mental energy levels and create a culture of recharging.
Yeah, for sure. All right, let's take a quick break and then we'll be right back to dive into even more of David's insights.
You know, one thing that I found really interesting is how David's perspective on leadership has evolved over time.
Oh, yeah. In what way?
Well, he mentioned that early in his career, he was often the youngest person in the room.
Oh, I bet that was intimidating.
And he felt this pressure to prove himself, which is understandable.
Totally, especially in a fast-paced environment like tech.
And he said that he used to try to be involved in every decision.
Thinking that's how you show your value.
Right, exactly. But he realized it was just so draining and ultimately not very effective.
Like spreading yourself too thin.
Yeah, you end up not doing anything well.
Right. So what changed?
Well, as he gained more experience, he realized that effective leadership isn't about micromanaging or having all the answers yourself.
It's about empowering your team.
Exactly. Trusting them to do what they do best.
So it's about delegation, but also about building trust, right?
Absolutely. He actually shared the story about a company retreat.
Oh, what happened?
So instead of presenting his own strategic plan, he decided to let his team come up with a company strategy.
Wow, that's a pretty big leap of faith.
He admitted that his younger self would never have done that. He would have felt like he needed to be in control.
That makes sense.
But he decided to let go, give his team the space to lead.
And how did it come?
Amazingly well, actually.
That's awesome.
They came up with a plan that was even better than what he had envisioned, which I think was a powerful lesson for him.
Like when you hire great people, trust them to do their thing.
Yeah, exactly. Give them the opportunity to shine.
And that applies to so many different areas, not just leadership.
It does, yeah. It's about recognizing that everyone brings something unique to the table.
And when you collaborate, you get the best results.
For sure. And, you know, this kind of goes back to that idea of creating a recharge culture.
Okay, how so?
Well, when people feel trusted and empowered, they're going to be more engaged and motivated, less likely to burn out.
Makes sense. It's all connected.
It is. And there's this other point that David brought up about mental health and productivity.
Interesting. What's the connection?
So he mentioned that a huge percentage of Calm users, like the majority, use the app for sleep.
Really?
Yeah, which I thought was fascinating because it seems like in this world that's so obsessed with productivity,
We always want to be doing more.
we often forget about sleep.
It's true. We push ourselves to the limit and sacrifice sleep to get things done.
But then that lack of sleep makes us less productive in the long run.
It's counterintuitive, but it makes sense.
Yeah, David pointed out that not getting enough sleep can lead to all these negative effects, you know, irritability, fatigue, difficulty concentrating.
Like running on fumes.
And he connected that to his own experience. You know, he talked about how when he was younger, he had some unhealthy coping mechanisms for dealing with stress and lack of sleep, like smoking.
He wishes he had tools like Calm back then.
He does, yeah.
It makes you think about how we talk about stress and fatigue. You know, we're often told to just push through it,
Right. Ignore those signs.
when really rest and recovery are so important.
They're not a sign of weakness. They're essential.
Exactly. So maybe instead of glorifying this hustle mentality, we should be talking more about taking breaks.
Yeah, prioritizing our well-being.
Our brains need breaks just like any other muscle in our bodies.
If you keep pushing yourself without giving your brain time to rest, you're not going to perform at your best.
Makes sense.
David said he used to believe he could just power through fatigue.
But then he realized his work suffers when he does that.
Yeah, poor decisions, lack of creativity.
So taking breaks isn't just about feeling better. It's about doing better work.
Totally.
I love that.
Now he incorporates short breaks and recharge activities throughout his day, even just a quick walk or listening to music or meditating for a few minutes.
So it's about building those moments into your day.
Finding those little pockets of time.
I think that's really helpful advice.
And, you know, speaking of meditation,
Yeah.
I think some people are skeptical about mindfulness and meditation.
Yeah, they might think it's a waste of time or something.
But David talked about how there's all this scientific evidence that shows the benefits, you know, reduce stress, better well-being.
And it actually makes sense if you think about it.
It does.
If you have a clear and calm mind, you're going to make better decisions,
Be more focused.
more
It's
creative,
like clearing out all the mental clutter.
or any space for new ideas.
Exactly. He actually cited this statistic that really surprised me.
What What was it?
61% of people feel expected to just get over stress.
Wow.
Push through it without acknowledging its impact.
That's kind of sad.
It is. It's like we're expected to be robots or something. Right.
Like, we're not supposed to have these human experiences.
But we're not robots.
We have emotions, we get stressed.
And ignoring those things isn't going to make them go away.
It's important to acknowledge those feelings.
And take steps to manage them in a healthy way.
David also shared another story about his own experience with anxiety as a teenager.
Oh, yeah.
And his mom, like a lot of parents, told him to just power through it.
Which I think comes from a good place.
It does, but it's not always helpful advice.
Right. Especially if you don't have the tools to understand what you're going through.
It just highlights the need for more education around mental health, especially for young people.
So they can build those coping skills early on.
David also pointed out that a lot of people feel so overwhelmed, they can't even think about planning for the future.
Right. Let alone figuring out their mental well-being.
They're just trying to survive each day.
Yeah. Just get through it.
Which makes it even more important for leaders to create a supportive culture.
Where people feel comfortable talking about these things.
And providing resources like mental health support or mindfulness apps.
It's about sending the message that taking care of your mental health is important.
Not a luxury, but a necessity.
Exactly. And it starts with leadership setting the tone.
Being vulnerable themselves.
Creating a safe space for these conversations.
David said when he started opening up to his team about his own struggles, it made a big difference at Calm.
More supportive, more authentic.
I think that's really powerful.
It's about normalizing these conversations.
Breaking down the stigma.
Yeah. And something else that David stressed was the importance of having a variety of recharge strategies.
Like a toolkit.
Exactly. Just like we have different chargers for our different devices.
We need different things to recharge ourselves.
So it's about finding what works for you, whether it's sleep, meditation, exercise, spending time with loved ones, being in nature.
Having that menu of options.
Yeah. And being intentional about making those things part of your routine.
He also challenged this idea that a lot of us struggle with.
What's that?
The idea that being busy means you're important or productive.
It's so hard to shake that belief.
It's ingrained in our culture.
But David shared some examples of really successful leaders who have challenged that notion.
Who did he mention?
Well, he talked about John Sculley, the former CEO of Apple.
Oh, wow, yeah.
And he embraced this title of Chief Listening Officer.
I love that.
He prioritized being present, listening deeply, instead of always doing.
And he found a lot of value in that.
He did. And then there's Jack Dorsey.
Oh, yeah, Twitter.
Yeah, and he talks about putting yourself in neutral.
What does he mean by that?
Taking time to step back, reflect, recharge.
So it's not about always being on.
Sometimes the most productive thing you can do is just be.
Counterintuitive, but true.
And finally, David ended the interview by talking about his vision for the future.
What does he hope to see?
He wants to see mental health education integrated into schools.
Oh, wow. From a young age.
He believes that if we start normalizing conversations about mental well-being early on, it'll make such a huge difference.
It's like planting a seed.
So that future generations have the tools and knowledge to prioritize their mental health.
What a powerful idea.
Imagine if kids were taught to recognize their mental energy levels, identify their rechargers, understand the importance of self-care.
That would be amazing.
It would be transformative.
And even though it might not be happening in schools yet, we can still start doing those things ourselves.
In our own lives with our families.
It's never too late to build those healthy habits. It really would. It would completely change things. Like, what if kids were taught to recognize their mental energy levels, from a young age?
Right. They could learn how to manage their energy instead of ending up burned out later in life.
Yeah. They'd have the tools to prevent it from happening.
Exactly. Like build those skills and habits early on.
It's such a powerful concept. And, even if it's not being taught in schools just yet, I think we can still do a lot. We can start incorporating these principles into our own lives.
And with our families, too.
Absolutely. Model those healthy habits for our kids.
Yeah. It's never too late to start.
Right. Well, this deep dive has been so insightful.
It really has. We've covered so much ground.
I know. It's amazing how much we've unpacked just from this one interview.
Right.
So we talked about the importance of understanding your mental energy, the different zones, how to recognize burnout.
And creating a culture that prioritizes recharging.
And challenging that idea that busyness equals importance.
Yeah.
And ultimately, prioritizing your mental health.
Which can be so hard in today's world.
It can, but it's so important. And it's something that David really embodies, both personally and in how he leads.
He does.
So I think his interview is a great reminder that we all have the power to create a more energized and fulfilling life.
Totally. It's within our reach.
It starts with awareness and self-compassion.
And a commitment to putting your mental health first.
And extending that to the people around you, creating that supportive culture.
at home, at work.
Everywhere.
It's a journey, not a destination.
I like that. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with one final question.
Okay, I'm ready.
It's inspired by David's vision for the future. How can we, both as individuals and as a society, contribute to normalizing conversations about mental well-being?
Ooh, that's a big one. How do we make those conversations as normal as talking about our physical health?
Right. Because it should be.
It should.
And I think it starts with each of us.
Being open.
Honest about our own experiences.
Yeah. And creating those safe spaces where others feel comfortable sharing their struggles.
Without judgment.
Without fear.
It's about challenging the stigma.
Promoting empathy.
Advocating for better resources.
Let's keep these conversations going with ourselves and with others.
I love that. Let's create a world where mental well-being is truly valued and supported.
That's the goal.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into recharging your mental battery. We hope you found it helpful.
Remember, taking care of your mental health is an investment, not a luxury.
Thank you for listening to the Speak Smart podcast, and subscribe my channel, like the hit button.